Lord Owen, there are various disparate questions that I've been asked to ask of you, so the next few questions are going to dot around from topic to topic. Could we have up on screen, please, then this is your testimony to the Archer inquiry, LDOW 40345, please, Henry. And if you could go to page 28. Page before that, please. Thank you. So if we see at the top of the page, this is in the context of the chair having asked you some questions about the Medicines Act. You say at the top of the page, I was actually the sponsoring minister for the pharmaceutical industry in those days. It was later taken away, and it was a very good relationship, in fact, so good that I argued inside the government and got permission for one moment to use the Medicines Act to deal with smoking, but it was eventually dropped. And then you're asked about whether the final say was with the committee, and you suggest the Secretary of State would be advised by the committee, the politicians would not get involved in that. The question is, what being sponsoring minister for the pharmaceutical industry actually entailed?
It was responsible for trying to develop into a world-beating international research-orientated manufacturing industry which would earn money for Britain and attract high-quality scientists to this country and research groups into this country. It involved at one stage, for myself, talking to Merck Sharp Doane and getting them to cite a research group here in the UK. It's since left. But it was above all trying to be a centre of excellence, building on the database, particularly of the National Health Service, which was available and still is available and is still used for clinical trials and groundbreaking research. It's not an accident that we have two major world-class pharmaceutical companies, GSK and AstraZeneca, here in the UK. And I think that we have to earn our living in the markets of the world, and I think we are in a position, because of the National Health Service and the knowledge base that it gives us, to continue to be a centre of excellence in medical and pharmaceutical research.
And did your role as sponsoring minister for the pharmaceutical industry affect at all your approach to applications such as that by ARMA that we saw in the documentation?
Not at all. I don't think, as I explained, a company who wants to sell their products in this country, first of all, has to go to what was then the Medicines Commission and others to get the say-so that it's of a quality that is sufficient. And those are pretty far-reaching tests. So the medical profession has to be satisfied that the product is, what it says on the label is true, and also that it's safe. In my case, I'm not quite sure, and I think I said that in evidence, quite why it was coming to me, other than that it was a hot potato, and they might have wanted me to know that this application was being made, and what extent we would take account of the fact that they were coming in at a lower price. Well, I wouldn't normally get involved in any price decisions. I was surprised when I read the piece of paper. I'd forgotten the meeting. But I think it was because it was politically sensitive, and maybe they had asked, what are the prospects for us? And that's why I specifically told them about our commitment to the World Health Organization's policy. Sorry, I can't be more helpful, but I don't think it conflicted at all.
And then you've made clear in your evidence your concerns over blood safety. You've referred to titmus and indeed the material that you would read in the BMJ and the Lancet and so on. As far as you are aware, were your concerns over safety shared by the doctors and civil servants within the department who were administering policies on a day-to-day basis?
I think self-sufficiency had been discussed well before I came into the department, and you rightly pointed out going back into the 1960s. And I think that we all have to recognize that. I think once I'd made the decision, the department rallied behind it completely. I love being in the department. I found that a stimulating place. People are not afraid to disagree with you and to debate and argue with you. But if you made up your mind and you knew what you wanted to do, I think they were loyal and very committed to seeing that the policy that you were advocating was introduced.
And did anyone ever express to you within the department a different view about safety than the view that you've articulated?
On safety?
On safety. On the risk from
If
blood
they
and blood
expressed
products.
a view on safety, that was a professional judgment, which is not for me. I had to abandon being a doctor at that moment. I wasn't there to challenge their view. If they had a view on safety, that prevailed.
But can you recall, and again, I'm acutely conscious of the fact I'm asking you about events a long time ago, can you recall if there were discussions within the department at which others within the department expressed a different view about the safety concerns than the view that you've expressed? Did they say that safety issues weren't important, for example, or that there wasn't a significant risk from blood or blood products?
I don't remember anybody coming to me and saying we should ban supplies coming in from overseas, because that issue was well ventilated in the and discussed quite frequently in the professional advisory bodies that had been set up by the chief medical officer. And I was well aware of them, but we know them. They are, what would be the consequences of not having doctors with what they thought was the right treatment for their patients and who they discussed with their patients and they wanted them to be, whether it was, in particular, AHG concentrate. So I think that's the fundamental thing. Cryoprecipitate we could always get from our blood transfusion service. We needed, so I think that was the main one. And I've discussed it very openly and all the dilemmas of that, but those issues were put to the specialist committee. We haven't actually mentioned it, but The Guardian ran a story about the 1983 decision, which went to the Committee on Safety in Drugs. I didn't mention it, about whether they should stop importing blood because of HIV. And again, that decision was we should continue. The problems are there, but not having this facility would be more damaging. You see, a lot of these decisions are decisions of shades of grey. They're not often black and white decisions. And remember, medicine is a biological science. It's not, they're not quite so clear-cut as some of the other scientific decisions, if for no other reason we were dealing with human beings and behavior is there. It's a perfectly legitimate view, and it was frequently discussed and in the professional bodies and under two successive chief medical officers of health, George Godber and Henry Yerlis, whether or not you should stop. They never advised ministers that that should be done. If they had done so, it would have been followed. Because on this, they are basically sovereign. You might have argued with them, but I wouldn't have done, and I don't think any of my predecessors or successors would have done. This was a decision of the medical profession. And then when they saw the possibility of self-sufficiency, most doctors grasped it, wanted it. And that was the case for the blood transfusion centres, by and large.
Were you ever, during your time as minister, asked to make any resources available for research into any forms of viral inactivation? Viral inactivation, so heat treatment or other methods of making products safe. Was that something that you were ever asked to consider?
Not to my knowledge, but again, that would be funded usually by research programs, which, broadly speaking, there was a chief scientist attached to the department, a very eminent and extremely able doctor and scientist. And he chaired the committee of where the government's research project. The Department of Health was a sponsor of research in academia and in clinical trials and a whole range of things. I think we were all the time looking for ways in which we could detect hepatitis in blood supplies. And a great deal of research was done. And I gave you this memo, which I found in my papers, but is in your official papers, of Henry Yellowly sending a Dear Doctor letter dealing with this issue of how you deal with the discrepancy of blood donors coming from certain countries where hepatitis was of epidemic proportions, and how to deal with this complex issue and to deal with it sensitively, and since it could be associated with colour, to getting a sort of semi-scientific way of looking at this. So I don't think this is different, Department of Health from Department of Education or something like that. I wasn't ever in the Department of Education. More analogous to the being Minister for the Navy, where you do give a special regard to and independent view to the admirals and the generals and the air marshals, and you do the same in the Department of Health to doctors and scientists. I think the ministers are much more prone in those two departments to be guided by the professional advice. They find that's not just the right case to do, but almost the moral case to do. You have to trust professionals.
Did you know anything of in terms of the UK's own blood donation system, of the practice of taking blood from prisoners in the United Kingdom? Was that something you were ever asked to consider?
Yes, funnily enough, that Dear Doctor letter deals with the question of whether you should stop donations from prisoners. It's a paragraph of it, so perhaps you would circulate that document.
Yes, well, in fact, we're going to be looking at it tomorrow. So.
Okay, yeah.
But you were aware that
Yes.
blood was taken from prisoners?
Yes, they looked at that professionally, and to see whether it was, and he deals with that in a paragraph on the second page.
And did it occur to you to take any steps to intervene to stop that practice?
No. I've tried to make you accept that these are professional judgments. You know, we wouldn't if the Chief of Defence Staff, who's trying to coordinate all the views across it, comes and argues for a particular weapon system over another, your bias or your predisposition is to accept their professional advice. You're not a soldier, seaman, or an airman. You may query the cost. You may query that it's not as high a priority as some other weapon system. Is it? But if they held to their ground, you tend to go with it. I mean, I don't think we should be too ashamed of saying that. On the other hand, you exercise your political judgment to question them about their priorities and question their advice and ask them for the evidence for their advice. It's a difficult question of how the layperson deals with professional advice when it's highly specialized on science.
And then, Lord Owen, in your witness statement, Henry, sorry, it's WITN 06630001. Paragraph 15, sorry, page 6, paragraph 15. So page 6, please. Previous page, sorry. Thank you. So in paragraph 15, you say this: what doctors were advised to say to patients was the responsibility of the then Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Henry Yellowlees. I had the greatest confidence in his expert knowledge of public health, and it was certainly not for me to intervene in that professional relationship from the CMO, having consulted specialists, to the medical profession. At all times, I encouraged the greatest possible transparency between the large haemophiliac community, their organisations and the department. There are two questions I've been asked to ask arising out of that. The first is, in terms of the statement at the end that you encourage the greatest possible transparency between the community organisations and the department, the question is how you did that. What steps were taken as far as you can recall?
Yes?
What steps were taken by you to encourage that transparency?
Well, I remember asking how often they were in contact with the Haemophiliac Society. I would ask how much they were trying to share their experience of within these committees. I did look carefully at the advisory membership of committees, where people came from. Was there a balance of professionals? You didn't want only haemophiliac experts, example, or AIDS experts. You wanted well-grounded scientific opinion, and wasn't for me to choose the people, but it was for me to make sure that the advice was broadly based and not only dominated by London teaching hospitals, for example, where it's much easier to pull them in from London, you know. They consult the Royal College of Physicians. There's a constant linkage between the Royal Colleges, and I think this is a good structure that we have in Britain. And I do remember once going to the Royal Colleges and saying you got too close to the government, and they should value their independence. And government will always try and bribe them off with good grants and everything like that. And that's the nature of the beast. The politician will try to gather consensus around it. The Royal College has got to be very careful about keeping their independence. And they're not answerable to anybody other than their professional body. I mean, I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, and I'm proud of that and proud of the college. But sometimes they get overwooed by government.
The second question arising out of paragraph 15 that I'm asked to raise with you, Lord Owen, is this. Given what you've said about the serious risk of infection from contaminated blood, why did the department not make any public statement about the extent of that risk to inform patients? Why did the department leave it to individual doctors to tell their individual patients?
It's a very good question, and maybe one that inquiry wants to look at. Is there too much freedom given to the profession? And should we be more ready to give advice from the department, which is effectively an instruction? You would meet huge resistance. That's I mean, after all, why was the medical profession and the BMA against the creation of the National Health Service initially? Because they feared that Narendra Bevan would start to run the health service and tell them what to do, and doctors would lose their independence. And it was always bogus, but it was used, and it's still used in America. They call it socialized medicine. And they say that actually, I personally argue with many of my American friends, and my wife is American, that there is more freedom within the British National Health Service for clinical freedom than there is in an insurance-based health system as you have in America, which actually is much tougher in holding doctors to routines and structures. So you gain something, you lose something, but you know, I'm hopelessly prejudiced about this, of course. I watched my father as a general practitioner. I watched him from a very small boy. I used to go out in the car with him to keep him company when he went out to Dartmoor and sort of some remote farm. When I was a medical student, I would go into the farmer's house with him. He'd always go first and ask for permission, and he would teach me medicine in his own way. We'd come to usually the same diagnosis, but somewhat different routes because of our age differences. I'm an utterly committed supporter of the National Health Service. I'm totally opposed to the marketization of the health service. You know, I believe in this, and I don't believe you could have a British National Health Service if you had done what the scaremongers said, that you would have politicians running the health service, politicians telling you what medicines you can or cannot have. If you were pretending politicians refusing to let doctors argue for an expensive treatment. This dialogue that exists in the British system and the trust that people have built up that they are not going to be told by the politicians what their medical treatment. Broadly speaking, in the National Health Service, we have this thing called NICE, which is to try and evaluate the cost effectiveness of medicine. But it's broadly speaking guidance. Sometimes does say you can't do this treatment. It's often very controversial when they do it. They have that well-regarded scientific assessment, fairly recent in the National Health Service. I think it's hated by the pharmaceutical companies around the world, but broadly speaking, I think it has got the right balance of trying to draw attention to doctors that they're making. The average general practitioner is making decisions every year in the millions, a $250,000, or a consultant. You know, you're making very expensive decisions, and everybody needs to be cost conscious. You can't refuse to face up to the consequential effects of spending huge sums on very expensive cancer therapy at the moment. Does this answer the question?
I think I asked you a why question, and you've explained your thinking. So, there are then a couple of specific questions relating to Wales and to Northern Ireland that I've been asked to raise with you. The Welsh and Northern Irish chief medical officers, did they report to you and to the Secretary of State, or did they report to the Secretary of States for the particular regions?
It was, I think, we asked that earlier, it was devolved to some extent, but there were some groups where the scientific advice to the chief medical officer gave advice also to Wales and to Northern Ireland, a little less so from Scotland, because the scientific, as I told you, they have their own Scottish Royal College of Physicians and their own Scottish Royal College of Surgeons. They have a larger number of medical schools in the universities, so that Scotland is more self-sufficient, if you might say, in terms of medical advice and things like that, and more traditionally independent, way before all the current debates about independence and other things. Northern Ireland, as I said, varied because sometime during this period there was under direct rule.
I think that for the whole of the period for which you were concerned.
Yeah, so that would be the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland would take decisions, but be hugely influenced by. They would tend never to go against the grain of decisions that were taken in England, but they had the freedom to do so if they wished to, and they had to take account, of border questions and what was happening in Dublin. And again, it was good relations. All the time I was in office with the Republic on healthcare matters, I can't remember ever any difference of opinion.
You said in your earlier evidence that it was in principle possible for the Chief Medical Officer, and you were here dealing with the Chief Medical Officer for England, to issue some form of directive or guidance that overrode the views of regional medical officers or doctors. Did the Welsh or Northern Irish Chief Medical Officers have the same ability, as far as you know, in exceptional cases or otherwise, to issue such directions or instructions?
Yes, I think they did. There would be some. I mean, you're seeing it on your screens every day, more or less in COVID. The Chief Medical Officer is making his views very clear, and the politicians, broadly speaking, are listening to him, and quite rightly so. But he's balanced by the Chief Scientist, happens to be a medical doctor, but it wouldn't necessarily be the case that the Chief Scientist would be a medical doctor. And so there have been cases where the Chief Scientist was not a medical doctor, but would still be involved in advising the government on the science. And you're all beginning to understand, I think, science is a tricky issue. What is the truth? And the statisticians are needed, and so I'm sure the CMO can say to various of the bodies that are advisory, I'm afraid I disagree with you.
And in the event that the Chief Medical Officer for whichever nation did that, intervened on questions relating to clinical matters or safety, would you as minister, or whoever the minister was, nonetheless retain political responsibility for those decisions?
Yes. You could disagree with the Chief Medical Officer of Health if you wanted to. And you see, a lot of these relationships are, he comes to you to convince him of something he wants to do. You listen carefully, you question him, and then you decide to accept his advice. In that conversation, you can raise objections, and he would say, well, I'll go and think about this, or I'll go and discuss it with colleagues again. It's more consensual, the political relationship. And everybody's different. All in government departments are all different. The Foreign Office is notorious for having a view of foreign policy itself, and they don't like it if the Foreign Secretary disagrees with them. And I disagreed with them about quite a number of issues. And that was difficult because they didn't have the same, quite different tradition, the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Health. at the end of the day, the senior officials can always go up through the diplomatic service to the Prime Minister direct, or through the Civil Service Commission to the departmental head and to the Prime Minister direct.
And in terms of your self-sufficiency pledge in January 1975, was that a pledge that covered Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well as England?
In effect, yes. In practical terms, yes. In pedants' arguments, no. I mean, Scotland could have appealed to the Secretary of State for Scotland, and I think I did say it wouldn't come to me, it would be brought up directly with Barbara Castle, and they could take it to Cabinet. So the Secretary of State for Wales, Secretary of State for Scotland, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland had the right, certainly, to challenge a Ministry of Health decision for England. But in those days, it was more ready to accept it. And in the powers given to, in a pandemic, then you use emergency powers, and the powers of coordination are stronger. But devolution has given Wales and Scotland more independence, and they do have their own chief medical officers advising the First Minister of Scotland, First Minister of Wales. But you can see that they're trying hard, I think, to try to reach agreement in COBRA and other things on COVID. And we make a notice, there's a certain license for the Chief Minister in Scotland to make a little adjustment, people are saying. But they're broadly speaking, the Chief Medical Officer of Health constantly says on television that there are really no differences between the different chief medical officers in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in himself. And I think that is a good sign, and it's a sign that the professions are trying very hard to work together in a pandemic.
During the time you were Minister, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was, I understand, Merlin Rees MP.
Yeah.
Do you recall whether you ever had any meetings or discussions with him about the issues of self-sufficiency and blood contamination?
No, and Merlin was a friend, and I knew him, as a colleague in the House of Commons. We worked very well together when he was Home Secretary and I was Foreign Secretary. He wouldn't have hesitated to tap me on the shoulder as we were going through the division lobby and say, David, you're saying this and my people are saying something different. I mean, that's one of the advantages of the collegiate nature of the House of Commons, is that you are seeing each other. You actually, as long as, I hope, good sense prevails and you make them go physically through the division lobbies and not tap in your yes or your no, or your aye or your nay in a computer, this brings you all together, and quite frequently, and a huge amount of business is done in the division lobby.
We've seen from some of the documents we've looked at, and we obviously haven't looked at them all, records of meetings where there is certainly a representative from Scotland present, from the SHHD. To what extent, as far as you're aware, were there meetings on this specific issue, self-sufficiency, blood safety, factor concentrates, with any officials from the Welsh or Northern Irish equivalents?
Well, I was going to mention it, that I constantly mentioned, because I think it was such an important paper, Cash's BMJ article, which is very critical of the defence thing. And I kept saying 1980. It actually was published in 1987, so I would like to get that, if I could, the record corrected on that. I personally think it's a very good thing that Scotland is Scotland and has a distinctive say, and always has. And I'm a unionist. I believe in the union, but I'm a strong believer in devolution. I always have been. So I have no problem with the present constitutional settlement. In fact, I would go for making the nations a little bit more defined in the constitution and their rights. I think that's the next logical step to go after Brexit, to have a more federal structure, personally. So look at the benefit. One benefit we have is Scotland is being more generous to the sufferers of haemophilia and AIDS than England, Wales, or Northern Ireland.
But just dealing specifically with Northern Ireland and Wales in the 1974 to 1976 period.
I think it was much more collegiate, much more wanting to be together, and there was none of this posturing of separation. I use my words deliberately. I think there's a lot of posturing, and I think it's not helpful, but there we are, that's life, you have to live with it.
And do you know whether consideration was ever given to sending plasma collected in Wales to the PFC, the fractionation centre in Edinburgh, for processing? Were there ever any discussions that you were privy to about Wales and Scotland establishing a relationship in the way that we know that Scotland and Northern Ireland did?
I would encourage more discussions. Remember, these professional bodies, they're all treating haemophilia. They usually have conferences annually, sometimes more or less. They have trained. You can train in Scotland and practice all your life in England, or vice versa. They know each other. That's why it's so important that the advisory board that the chief medical officer in England sets up should be broadly based. And I think that applies to everything.
There are just three further questions from call participants, Lord Owen. The first is this. Did the dire financial situation, that's the language of the question, did the financial situation in the 1970s, including the 1976 IMF bailout, impact upon funding decisions to achieve self-sufficiency?
Yes. The first 2 years under Barbara Castle, and I pay tribute to her. She was a fantastic boss. We often had quite considerable differences in the different political positions inside the Labour Party, but we practically never had any really major disputes. And I found her a stimulating leader and somebody who liked discussion and even disagreement. So I have no problems at all about that whole structure. I lost a bit the conversation. The question again, if you could come back to it.
The specific question, you answered with a single word, I think. It was about the financial situation in the mid-1970s.
It was huge. I mean, look, we had the IMF to satisfy. That happened after I was in government. I was in the Foreign Office by the time the IMF discussions had come. But we'd had to pull back on public expenditure. And then we had devaluation, in which the value of the pound goes down in everybody's pocket. And so we all felt the pinch. So all through this difficult time, you had to weigh very hard the difficulty. I mean, when on your film, the gentleman from Northumberland, or was it?
Dr. Peter Jones, Newcastle.
Yes, wanted 20, whatever it is, million. Was it more than 20 million? I mean, I just smiled, I wanted 20 million more. We all wanted it for everything. And you have to choose, and it, of course, is difficult. But we did it. This is what is important to keep remembering. The department made their observations. I made the decision. They loyally followed it. They chased. They guarded. They pushed things, and that limited amount of money achieved a substantial way towards self-sufficiency. It didn't achieve it, but against a rising trend of demand, it overachieved what we expected. So I don't think there's any reason for anybody who was involved in the department during that period to hang their head in shame about this at all.
I've been asked to raise with you an observation you made about Lord Hunt. You said in your earlier evidence that what Lord Hunt said about self-sufficiency being driven by cost was a blatant lie.
If I may interrupt, I didn't say he said it. It was in the briefing document, which he published, and there were some bull points. It was the second bull point. He never said it, and to great credit. I haven't read every word he said in the House of Lords debate, but I don't think he used that bull point, and I hope he didn't. But that was what I worried about. Where did that come from? Was that a political appointee putting up a sort of party political stuff, And but then it's understandable. It wasn't clear, and if it was that, well, that's just party political badinage. But if it was the department thinking that, then that was very worrying, because it was manifestly not true.
We'll try and check the reference then and see whether I need
It's
to
a
pick up on
briefing
that.
note. No, Lord Hunt, to the best of my knowledge, did not say that.
Thank you. And then a question which I'm asked to ask you, and I want to get the way in which it's put precisely as I've been asked to put it. Is the evidence which you have given to the inquiry, are giving to the inquiry, restricted to any extent by the fact of you being a Privy Councillor or by any obligations under the Official Secrets Act? Or is your ability to give a full and frank account of your knowledge about matters falling within the inquiry's terms of reference restricted in any other way?
None at all. I don't believe that I feel I would say anything any different. Anyhow, I've sworn the oath would override all of these except for Official Secrets Act. And Official Secrets Act, there's nothing. You never see in the Department of Health a classified document which, UK eyes only or something like that. You see that the whole time in the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Ministry, Foreign Affairs. But no, never really. There are very few things you can't be open about. We weren't open about the first case of I've got a blank. What's the illness that's all over Africa? And Ebola. Yes, the first case of Ebola came in, and the chief medical officer came in himself, shut the door behind him, and my private secretary was not at the meeting. And he told me that we were having a plane flying in with a case of Ebola, and this is how he wanted to handle it. And it was to send it straight down to Porton Down, which then was a Ministry of Defence establishment. It's no longer that, and was dealing with research into chemical weapons, and had the facilities to completely isolate the patient and to deal with very, very high quality and level of treatment. And I said yes, and we, I think, kept this quiet for a while until it was clear that we were able to handle the whole thing. But that was a very serious medical emergency, and we were, both of us, very frightened that it would somehow break out, whether on the airport, on the way down. Once they were there, we were completely confident they would confine it and contain it. But that was the most secret, if you like, thing I think I ever had when I was Minister of Health. And we kept it very tight as the number of people who knew about it.
I've been asked to return to one question and answer that you gave in this current session. I'd asked you the question about why the department didn't take any steps to publicise the risk to patients, why it was left to doctors. And I think you talked about the issues of clinical freedom.
Well, I don't agree with that. Didn't take any steps to publicise it.
Forgive me, carry on.
Document after document poured out for the medical profession, but for nurses, for There was no secret in medical education. Medical students were taught about the side effects of all these things. Articles were written. I went myself on World in Action. I answered questions in House of Commons, but also on the BBC. I don't think I ever used... where you have to be a little bit careful with what you say is the fear factor. And that's a real problem. And I do believe that must be for the doctors to say, what are the side effects of drugs, not so much for the politicians, because they can put it in context to their patient. And that's why, and I'm sure there are many haemophiliacs who will tell you that their doctor wouldn't move them off cryoprecipitate into AG concentrate. And it did cause a little bit of tension between them. They were advised to be careful about this, and if they were mildly treated, mild symptoms, and we did try and deal with the donor size. I've dealt with all this, but I'm just trying to say I understand this feeling, and particularly a young child who then in adulthood realizes that they were exposed to these things, feels anger, resentment. I really understand it, and I wish one could find an alternative way of doing it. But in the end of the day, it's either the general practitioner, the one-on-one relationship in the family, or with these very high-quality advisors on haemophilia. Sometimes the GP would say it is the job of the specialist. I've given it to the specialist. The specialist must be the person who is taking it. They're up to date. They know all the different things and where the treatment is coming from. Now, sometimes perhaps that was not told, and I'm sure there are people, I hope not too many, but people who genuinely were never told at any level. I understand why young children were not told. That was up to the parents to take. But if they were of age, then they should have been told, and the parents should have been told. And I'm sure the medical profession failed them a little on this, as we as politicians have failed them. We have to face up to it. We did not achieve self-sufficiency. I did not achieve self-sufficiency. I deeply regret that. And I don't think the politicians can walk away from this, or the medical profession can walk away with it. But it was very difficult to achieve. But we were warned. And the facts were out there. And the medical profession, you produced very good evidence that the chief medical officer, Godber, had the facts. And, book were published, Titmuss did his bit, the television programs. There was no, as far as I really know, I don't believe there was a climate of secrecy about this in any way inside the Department of Health. It was just felt that the way you would tell people would depend on what their condition was. How mild was the dosages? How bad were they affected?
So is this correct? Leaving aside, and you've rightly pointed to your interview on the World in Action, which could be said to be a statement to the public. It's a public television broadcast. Leaving aside that, the department's position was that the question of what doctors told patients about the risk of blood products was a matter for the patient-doctor relationship. And the department did not, as I say, leaving aside any television broadcasts, itself take any steps to either tell doctors what they should say to patients or provide information directly to patients.
Correct. The department does not interfere with the doctor-patient relationship. The chief medical officer writes to doctors. The chief medical officer appoints advisory committees. The chief medical officer has a constant flow of information coming from the professional royal colleges and everything else. But the department does not decide the treatment of a patient. That is done through the medical profession. And that is what we call clinical freedom. And that is much prized, and I would be very, very, very worried about a politician who wanted to change that relationship. And as I say, that was the smear against Anarin Bevan. That was what was the argument, that this is what would socialized medicine was going to be. And as I told you, I think there's more freedom inside socialized medicine if you still call the NHS a socialized model, which I have some considerable doubt, personally. No, I wouldn't will that on you, that politicians start getting involved in medical treatment. This may be a sign of failure, may not work wonderfully well, but I can assure you a hell of a lot more grievous mistakes would be made if the politicians started deciding on treatment.
Lord Owen, before I ask you if there's anything else you want to add, I'm just going to turn my back and see whether there is anything else that anyone is pressing me to raise. And I'm happy to say that nobody is. So Lord Owen, those are my questions for you. It may be that Sir Brian has some questions for you, and I think you wanted to add something at the end.
Yes, just a few questions, if I may. I don't want to keep you there any longer than is necessary.
Totally at your disposal.
Thank you very much. As a matter of principle, do you see it as one of the first duties of the state to look after the safety of its population?
Yes.
So that will extend to the safety of patients receiving blood or blood products?
Yes.
You said, in part of your evidence this morning, something which I pricked my ears up at. It was in the context of your advocating something like the New Zealand system of no-fault compensation. And you said this, we've got to stop relying on governments to make awards or judgments of liability and inadequate payments after years of pressure in Parliament and all this, and go for the New Zealand system with no-fault compensation and take it out of the law courts, take it out of all this confrontational system, and accept that in healthcare we sometimes damage patients. Not willingly, not wantingly, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes, and this is the part I want to ask you about, sometimes out of, in this case, deliberate decision. So you see it as a deliberate decision that was taken by someone or some system that had the effect of hurting patients.
I think that the financial limitation on the health service, I mean, you can't be Minister of Health very long without realizing that ideally you would have very substantially more money to spend. And it is interesting that the United States spends a great deal more than we do on healthcare. I mean, it's up in the 15-16% of GDP, and some people say it's even higher. And do they achieve a very much better overall healthcare system? I think most people think not, and most international comparisons think not. And for a long time, the British health service was thought worldwide to provide the best healthcare and the most cost-effective. I don't think we can make some of those claims as easily now as we could have done 15 or when I was Minister of Health. I think that was the report of the Commonwealth Fund that used to look at international comparisons. We came out very, very, very highly. We did neglect cancer care for quite a while, and our figures were poor compared with quite a lot of the other European countries. They've improved recently. So I think that financially, we do make decisions as politicians in the overall allocation to the Department of Health. And we could argue you should spend a lot more on health. And I've spent quite a lot of my time arguing that. And I would go to the meetings with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury asking for more money every single year when I was there. And I'd come back in the first year very pleased. And then the second year, less so, and the third part of the third year, not at all happy about the amount of money that I was able to spend. Then within it, so it is effectively a ration system. I use the word rationed and people objected. Barbara Castle took me in and was rather angry with me. 3 weeks later, she was using the term herself with relish. It's the only way of explaining it. You can't pay for everything.
So just help me, if one were to ask, what was the deliberate decision that damaged patients in this case? What would you say?
Well, I think that you could ideally have made the decision a lot earlier to go for self-sufficiency. We knew about the contamination of blood supplies. We did know about hepatitis. We didn't recognize AIDS for quite a while, but in 82, from 82 onwards, it was recognized, and blood transfusions still went on.
So the deliberate decision is really a failure to decide to go for or ensure self-sufficiency earlier.
I think we must all take, politicians must take collective responsibility, and I take my share of it. I went into Parliament in 1966, and we ought to have recognised the consequences for the blood transfusion service. It should have been an issue a lot earlier, and an awful lot of people didn't know Titmus's book, and a lot of people didn't know until they watched 2 programs on about these issues. So we're seeing this over COVID. Did we spend enough on preventative health? And did we have an efficient enough track and trace system in record already on that? Preventive health, the problems we hear about track and trace now are all there in the public expenditure cuts of successive governments on preventive health and local public health. Don't have to look very far for that, and no doubt eventually we will face up to that truth. We did publish, in Barbara Castle in my time, a pamphlet, a little booklet really, Prevention, Everybody's Business it was called, and I think we do neglect prevention because the drama is associated with renal transplant or cardiac replacement or some of the brilliant surgery that's going on, robotics and everything like this. And London teaching hospitals take a very large percentage at one time and less so now. So the allocation of money is, you could say, a moral question.
Just on the money side, can I understand better what the arrangements were in particular with Elstree? Let me tell you why I ask. My understanding, but it may be wrong, you may correct me, is that in the 1970s until 1977, Elstree was run by the Lister Institute, which was not an arm of government. It was not a commercial pharmaceutical company, but it was an institute which had 2 limbs to it. One, for many years, it had been engaged in research, privately funded for that purpose. I think it may have come about because of TB and polio some years at the start of the end of the Victorian era, start of the Edwardian. But it was beginning to run out of money, as I understand it, in 1970, and rapidly so with the increase in inflation. Is that about right?
Yes.
So it would have had no money for its second arm, which was research.
So I didn't catch the last sentence.
It would have had less money to spend on its second limb of its activities, which had been research.
I think it was a mistake for it to be run by the Lister Institute. I think it was a mistake not to take it into very different structure.
But at the time you were Minister of Health then, until I think it was 1977 when it became the joint responsibility of the DHSS and the North West Thames
Yes.
Regional Health Authority, the Blood Products Laboratory, though part of the National Blood Service, wasn't centrally funded.
Quite right.
So the production of NHS, as we call it, factor concentrate by BPL.
The region was acting for the NHS as a whole, if you like. That was quite a common pattern. You gave to a regional health authority a national provision. I can't think of other things, but I think there are more examples of that. You see, the executive arm of the health service were the regional health authorities in England, with a great deal of independence.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because the way in which blood transfusion worked was as far as England and Wales were concerned, was a question for the local regional health area,
Yes.
the regional transfusion centre. And so they could have different policies.
Mm-hmm.
They could defer different donors or accept different donors.
Yes?
And it was funded out of the Regional Health Authority budget, was it?
Yes.
And that budget would have to spend money on what you've described, I think, already as other challenges of health, but perhaps the more obvious ones, the cardiovascular, the problems which people had orthopedically, diabetes, cancer, the big health issues as they may have seemed at the time. And to fund a central laboratory for supplying, or to a state where it could supply factor concentrate to the whole country, would have demanded some top slicing of their cash.
Yes.
I imagine there might have been reluctance about that.
Well, you have to remember that the election took place, and the first and only issue for Barbara Castle, and I hadn't even been announced to be appointed Minister of Health. And she said, David, stay, I would like you to hear this conversation. And the Permanent Secretary to the department came in and said, Mrs. Castle, I want to say to you one thing. I'm going to pose you a question about whether or not you will carry out the McKinsey's massive transformation of the health service under Sir Keith Joseph. And we are going to argue that you should let it go and not follow your manifesto commitment to make changes. But if you decide to do it and to not take our advice, we will loyally follow what your decision is. And here was this, people think of a dogmatic Mrs. Thatcher's equivalent on the left, if you like, and with some justice, but abrasive and confident. And she listened to all these very powerful arguments against making a change when only in a few weeks' time was the appointed day when the new Keith Joseph thing was unraveled. And they explained at every stage what are the problems of, and of course the role of the region and the area health authority and everything like that was all redefined in this district three-tier structure. She listened to all these questions, and then she turned to me, and I had to say, I wasn't even appointed. And she said, David, well, what do you think? And I must say, I took my courage in both hands because I wasn't at all sure which way she was going to come down. And I said, well, you know, we fought an election on a manifesto which is to change the structure. But we're being told here by objective evidence that if we start tinkering with the system, the whole thing will collapse. It just won't be able to take it. And I think they're right. And she said, I agree with you. I was staggered. But from that moment on, we accepted that structure. And I think this is one of the real problems for politicians, is do you go on tinkering with the machine, or when do you say you can do this safely? Because almost all of these reconstructions and reorganizations take time to settle down. So we effectively accepted, with some minor changes to making the consumer health councils slightly more democratic, we accepted the structure. And that's the political system we live with, and not, it's quite unusual for somebody to show as much pragmatism as Barbara Castle did in that decision. But she, helped by the fact that she'd already served in government from '64 and learnt a lot and been a good minister and a good executive, actually. But that was the problem that we hung over us. And throughout this decision, as I tell you, I referred to Barbara Castle, to Abel Smith at one time, the whole structure. We were on a very difficult line of being very careful about making these changes in the situation, but maybe we should have done. It's, you know, a decision which I never asked for, and I don't want to make this decision and Barbara's counsel. I took a decision too. That, this is too fragile to go and have a massive reconstruction. Now, this wouldn't have been a massive one, but taking it away from the regional health, which then was an acceptable system for the others, because they would trust that particular regional chairman to consult them a good deal on the blood transfusion service. I ruled it out, basically. We were living with a period in which we were not going to make big structural changes. We were going to sit through it. And then as the economic crisis deepened, we became more and more convinced that that had been the right decision. And as I say, it was not mine, it was Barbara's. But I thought it was a very courageous decision for her to make.
Under the structure as you had it, and the structure that you weren't going to tinker with, am I right in thinking there would have been two possible routes for providing funds to develop and improve the facilities at Elstree, assuming that you could provide that money to what was then a private institute, the Lister? One would have been direct payment out of central funds. The other would have been to ask the regions to contribute an aliquot so that together they could have the advantages of having a BPL supply them all.
Yes, it would have been possible.
And the second of those two would have involved quite a lot of horse trading, I imagine, on a political type of level. I don't know. You tell me. With the regions to extract the necessary money.
To put it into a completely private commercial arrangement, to give it to a company, you mean?
Well, to give it to the Lister.
Give it to?
The Lister Institute to fund BPL.
Well, I don't think that was been the right place for it. If you were going to do a major reconstruction, I think you could have I think given it is true to say that I spent very little time on that issue at all. I knew that it was wrong and that it would have to be looked at. And I was against quite a lot of these executive powers continued to be maintained by the regions when you created this new area. So you'd have we had districts, areas, and regions. And we kept, in my view, ridiculously a large number of powers for the regions. And I was totally opposed to that. But that would have been immediately seen as dismantling the regional structure if you'd done that. So you would have gone into a hell of a row about that. By and large, I mean, I had not much business experience, but I had spent 2 years, not very widely known, but working for a MIT company on structural changes in business under a professor of marketing called Arnold Amstutz, who was a very brilliant man who formed his own company. So I was not completely inexperienced in that, and I had also spent time running the dockyards as Minister of Health, which had an industrial labour force of as Minister of the Navy of over 60,000, and closing one of them too. And it was dealing with the Whitley Council and everything like that. So I'm not totally, and I wasn't hostile to the idea of different structures, but I think that things were very fragile. We only had a very small majority, and we barely had a majority. So all of this would meant unpicking the Keith Joseph legislation. I think the Legislative Committee would have told you this isn't a priority. So you were, if the electorate decides to give a government only a limited by 66 we'd won the election and got more of a majority, but I'm trying to wonder the whole election schedule. In that election, it was 66 was in the summer, wasn't it? So we came in with a big majority, that's right. We could have done it, I suppose. But another reorganisation of the National Health Service, Cabinet would have had to agree, the Legislative Committee would have to agree. I don't think they'd have given us the time of day. But
could you?
I mean, I understand why, looking at it now objectively, the structure was wrong.
Yes.
Of that I have no doubt. And you may be right, and I'm sure you'll say so if you come to that conclusion. But I'm trying to give you the picture of why it was more or less ruled out because of the Keith Joseph reorganisation.
On the same general theme, I'm sorry if we haven't got a copy, if Henry doesn't have available, DHSC 013024_126. But this is 27th of July 1974, and it's a BMJ editorial. And it's about the blood donors and the transfusion service. Mm-hmm. And while Henry's looking, I'm sorry, normally Council gives these references in advance. I didn't know until listening to you that I was going to ask.
Will it come up?
It.
Yeah.
You've got it, have you? No. But essentially it was an editorial which argued that that the blood transfusion service was ill-equipped to do the job as a modern transfusion service. And it, amongst other things, it suggested that the shortage, as it called it, of blood allowing entries to the pharmaceutical companies was not a real one, but a consequence of poor administration, organisation, and underfunding. Do you have a view on that? You must have read it at the time.
I agree with it. And I think it was quite inappropriate to be put into a regional health authority, who personally I think should have been more or less demolished as part of the structure, and it should have been areas and a stronger department. And so I would have found no difficulty, and I don't actually think I would have found too much difficulty in asking a major pharmaceutical company to do it as an agency arrangement for the government. I think I hold strong views about the marketisation of the National Health Service, but I don't want the National Health Service to become a pharmaceutical company. And I wanted competition amongst pharmaceutical companies. And I think that was an essential factor, trying to keep prices down. So I have no wish within a National Health Service to have a hostile attitude to the private sector working in partnership with the British National Health Service, and there are certain areas which I think you're not involved in. I was worried about creating a company like we did with BPL on blood transfusion, privatizing that and selling it to Bain, because you were not giving it to a pharmaceutical company like Glaxo or SmithKline or AstraZeneca. It has a permanent presence in the pharmaceutical industry. Bain is a venture capitalist, effectively. Now, we sold it, but now where it is, our blood in this country at the moment comes from the United States. And the United States is picking quarrels with lots of countries outside. You've lost control of a very important element. So if you were going to privatize, I would have chosen a British company, and I would have chosen them with expertise, and that would be the pharmaceutical company. Now, it is interesting, at that particular time, I did have a businessman who came from Burroughs and Wellcome, who was advising me. And the first question, almost when I became minister, was the same permanent secretary who said to Barbara Castle, came to see me, he said, I thought you would probably want him to leave. And I said, what makes you think that? He said, I said, I want the best advice on the pharmaceutical industry I can. And if he ran Burroughs and Wellcome and he's ready to come and work for me, I'm only too happy for him to stay. So I do think, in my case particularly, this is not motivated by what can or cannot be done by the private sector. It was a decision to try to go for self-sufficiency as quickly as possible and not to get saddled with a whole legislative argument and the business of saying that you were trying to get rid of the regions, you were trying to change the Keith Joseph reform, and you were running against McKinsey. And if McKinsey's were so bright, why the hell didn't they, as part of their restructuring, deal with the blood transfusion service? They spent a couple of years, vast sums of money. This was no time for a minister of health, particularly a junior one like me, to take on the whole of this issue of restructuring the regions, which is what was involved with taking it away from it. They would never have believed us if we'd said, oh, we're not really after it. They would see it as an attack on the regional health authorities, which we'd already said we didn't like.
Can I change tack just a little? It's a linked area, perhaps, but it's rises out of this. Back in 1952, on the 21st of July, there was a WHO, World Health Organization report. If there is a reference, I'm not sure if it's available, but it's RLIT 40215. But essentially, part of it dealt with the question of how to minimize the risks of serum hepatitis. And it came up with 5 basic principles, 5 things that might be done. Now, the first of those was donor selection, and you've dealt with that in your evidence. You've described how one would select the voluntary, unremunerated blood donor in preference to the paid donor for the reasons you've explained, and you would not wish to have anyone who had ever been yellow or jaundiced. Mm-hmm. The second was pool size.
Sorry?
Pool size.
Yes, pool, yeah.
And you've indicated that
Absolutely.
that was something well on your radar and that of the department in the 70s when you were minister. And you would see an advantage in keeping the pool size as small as possible, presumably. Did you happen to know, did any of your advisors know what the difference was between the NHS pool size and that from the commercial concentrates which were being imported?
Yes, I think there was a paper which I found only a few nights ago, which does look at this issue of, in really quite a lot of detail and depth. And I wasn't sure where it had come from, and I wasn't sure whether I'd read it, but it was in my papers. But it was, I don't know is the answer, but I mean, I know that there was a comparison of commercial blood, and it went into, I think, into pool size comparisons. I can't remember the figures.
Did you have any sense about the relative sizes, that one was smaller than the other?
My hunch would be, given my general disrespect for the blood transfusion service, that their pool size was larger, but I don't know.
The third matter which the WHO drew attention to as a safety measure was taking steps to inactivate the virus, or to treat the plasma.
Mm-hmm.
That, I suspect, might have involved research.
This is the 52 document.
The 52 document, and obviously the principles followed through. But in the 1970s, was, to your knowledge, any research being done on how to treat plasma to reduce the risks of serum hepatitis?
I can't remember. I think there was a lot of research. There was some German research on this. I don't know what was done in Britain. It's the sort of field which would not be so much the chief medical officer, but Douglas Black, who is the chief scientist, ought to have been involved in that area. He was very good, a quality scientist. I don't know whether he, but he knew all about the problems we were dealing with as self-sufficiency. He was perfectly within his remit to come up with this. You can't know everything yourself, but the appointment of a chief scientist was, I think, a fairly recent one. It was a good one, actually. The chief medical officer of health. Medicine is not the same discipline as a scientist, and Douglas Black was of very high quality.
I don't want to put words into your mouth at all, but do I take it from your last answer that you can't recall specifically anyway any particular allocation of funds or effort in the department to researching how best to
well, the department does very little of that type of research. It isn't a research department.
No, but it could finance it and arrange it, couldn't it?
It could help finance. Most of that was done by the Department of Education as the sort of science related to the universities. Wellcome was not, of course, as strong as it is now, which takes a huge amount of medical research out of government, but on a sort of charitable basis. I don't think much research would have been generated by the regions, that's for sure.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
But I think you've given what would, from your earlier answer, what might be.
It was completely the wrong place for it. It was an agency for the rest of them, and it encouraged them all to believe that they were not part of a national health service, national transfusion service, and were individual regional fiefdoms. but they did take some authority from the nominal region that was in charge of it. But I mean, it was not. It was still very resistant. You can see it in the papers. They were resistant to ideas, resistant to the department coming in. And when we made the decision for self-sufficiency, the department officials and John Reed, the deputy chief medical officer, was treading on hot rocks, really. Had to go and persuade. They dealt with the regions through persuasion rather than through executive decision. They were, I mean, at this time, we made the decision to put all the new money that was decided as a result of the Butler report for regional security units. And new money was found and given to the regions. And it's one of the biggest scandals. They spent practically none of the money on the regional security. So this was already an element in which you saw that the regions just did what they wanted. They took from central government very difficult money to find to introduce the Butler report on regional security units, because Broadmoor used to be under us as well as all this, and they never spent it on it. Parliament is thoroughly critical of the whole thing. So they were very powerful figures, the regional chairman, and the permanent secretary was in constant dialogue and discussion with them, and so was the chief medical officer of health. And it was beneath, they didn't really answerable to the minister very much.
Well, thank you very much. The only other thing I wanted to ask you was this. You said at one stage in your evidence that if we had achieved self-sufficiency, then the supply of factor concentrates from America would have been stopped. Would that have been a formal stopping through the Medicines Act process or not?
Well, they were contractual, so you saw that in the armour. You had a decision to take whether they would be given the contract. I presume that by warning them that we were going to abide by the WHO resolutions, that you were telling them effectively your contract could be curtailed. Now, I didn't look at the contract, I'm sure, but I imagine that they, subsequent to warning them, that they would make some provision in the contract for termination, or they would make a contract for, well, not for 20 years, or, but you know.
So
you know that you make decisions and expect then certain consequences to flow from them. So if you tell Armagh that is, you expect then the contract division to take some account of it. Now, maybe they didn't. Maybe I should have followed up on that, find out whether they did or didn't. But there is no doubt we would have cancelled the contract, but we, at that stage, would have been a sensible decision to make sure that the contract wasn't going for too long, otherwise the compensation would be considerable. And that was presumably my intention when I said them, was to reduce the, I mean, you were into a commercial relationship, and I imagine and hope that they were given no long-term contract.
In terms of clinical freedom that would then have operated if the contract had been cancelled, would a doctor, let's say a purchasing haematologist in one of the regions, or his regional manager making a purchasing decision, would they have still have remained free to buy commercial concentrate, but in reality would never have done so because they'd have to find the money from somewhere and the region wouldn't give it?
Well, my implication in one of the papers that we've actually had before us today, I can't remember it exactly, it implies that they were doing just that they were considered that they were independent over this. I mean, I think considered that But in the area we were in which it had not yet been proven what we could do, that was a fight for another day. But I think that I definitely think they did have that freedom.
It's really a question of how far clinical freedom goes when somebody else controls the purse strings.
Yes. And that's the way you control the regions, was the allocation of money. Now, at this very moment, I'm having a fight with the thing called the Resource Allocation Working Party. I came in with a prejudice, maybe, but pretty good evidence for it, that the 4 London regions were taking far too much of the overall budget, and we had to change the allocation system. Again, you know, we were not, we didn't have a large majority, and so I took the decision that we would introduce an objective system for allocation resources based on deprivation statistics. And we set up the Resource Allocation Working Party. Now, technically, I could have said, this is the allocation, but all hell would have broken loose. And I had to devise a formula which was acceptable and scientifically based. And there was a very able civil servant at that time called Smith, who oversaw that process, produced a report, gathered a good deal of sympathy and understanding for the mechanisms on which the Resource Allocation Working Party. And we were all set to make an allocation based on that. And then there was an election and it was not taken. But you went for a long process, that. And it took 2 to 3 years to build a consensus that the allocations to the regions would be based on a different criteria, and it would mean slowly moving resources from London out into the provinces. Well, I'm a provincial figure. I was born in my constituency in Plymouth, and so I was no doubt looking after my own. But it was actually an objective attempt to try to allocate resources on the basis of evidence and not on the basis of prejudice or political persuasion. All I'm trying to indicate is, once again, you were trying to take a decision with a longer time scale and a fraught political situation. We did not like the McKinsey recommendations. We did not like the Keith-Joseph reforms, but we had decided that we would live with it.
Well, can I finished with my questions. I'm afraid I've detained you there far too long, and I'm sorry for those who are waiting.
You're the chairman of this
waiting for me to finish.
To last for as long as you like.
Well, maybe, but I may have overdone it, and
No.
so my apologies if I have.
No.
Can I just thank you hugely for coming. It's always difficult to sit in the witness chair, particularly as I made clear this morning, in these times when there are risks attached which go beyond the usual. And you are the first, and it's always difficult to be the first of a number of witnesses other than those who've been directly infected or affected by what took place. So on both those counts, you deserve our gratitude. But more than that, you've given us an insight, I think, into the way in which politics control Department of Health has worked, at least in your time. You've demonstrated the pressures and reminded us of what Bevan had to say about them. And you haven't shirked the acceptance of responsibility, individually, collectively, amongst politicians and Parliament for what took place or didn't take place. And that is brave, and thank you for that. You've given us a lot to think about. You've also given a commercial for Titmus's book. And can I just say, for anyone who wants to answer the commercial by going out and buying a copy, there are two versions, both of which I read, actually, one of which is the old edition, and one of which is a revised modern edition. It's the old edition you want if you ever do want to go and buy it. And Chapter 8 is the chapter which Miss Richards focused on, and I think is the right chapter to focus on for us in this inquiry. But there we are.
So I should just say I was going to ask Lord Owen the now standard question of whether there was anything that he wanted to add following the questions that he's answered.
I'll be trying to be very brief. Firstly, I'd like to make a correction in my own written evidence on page 18, para 46. I refer to John Morris. That's a mistake. It should be Alf Morris. I've already paid a tribute to Alf Morris. A lot of people out there are responsible for this inquiry, and not many of them are politicians, but there were some outstanding people. And Peter Archer, devoting his time as a former Attorney General to hold the Archer inquiry, was, I think, important, particularly for the morale of those people outside who are all the time campaigning for this inquiry. And we should be humble enough to admit, as politicians, that this inquiry was not taking place because of a conscious decision to do so. Successive governments, Labour, Conservative, and Liberal Conservative coalition governments, all refused it. It was eventually done because there was a parliamentary majority that was going to vote it through, and the government had no option. So we've all, us politicians, failed to face up to the fundamental thing: when things go wrong, be prepared to have a post-mortem. The medical profession has its failings, but it does actually try to systematically look at its mistakes, particularly when the patient is dead, and try to see if they could have done better. And we need to look at how to do better. And I would just say positively, I hope very much, as a result of this inquiry, there is some changes made, and I've indicated where I hope they will come. You mentioned the New Zealand no-fault compensation. There have been some proper serious studies of it recently, particularly in Scotland. I refer to that in my commission. I recommend it to people who are trying to look at ways of compatible with the National Health Service, which it looks as if we are going to go on having, and I bless that factor. Then the other question is the Ombudsman. I do think such a vast organisation as this has got to have another mechanism than the parliamentary debate one, and I hope the Ombudsman would be a success. I think it has not been a success, and I think that Parliament, and particularly you, I hope will look at it and make recommendations, because I think you would be very influential on all of those things. I've already referred to my mistake in referring to John Cash's demolition article, really, on the blood transfusion service in the BMJ. I often said it was 1980. It was actually 87, so I keep with that. So I end finally with a word of thanks for all those people who we had long debates with in the Haemophiliac Society, haemophiliac sufferers, AIDS sufferers, families, the people who've devoted a huge amount of things. I could name them all. One person who even went and got a self-educated and wrote an MSc on the whole issue of this, and still a big resource document for us. A lot of people have made this inquiry possible. A great many hopes and aspirations lie that we will, but above all, we politicians and we doctors, I'm a member of both, I still believe both are honourable professions, must ask ourselves many questions and look at many of our own internal procedures to try to make sure this sort of mistake doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much indeed.
So there are no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
And what do we have tomorrow?
Tomorrow is a presentation on the developing public, medical and scientific knowledge of the risk of infection from blood and blood products.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Owen, stay safe. See those of you who come back tomorrow.